Sometimes the person who changes your life forever is someone you were never supposed to meet. The doctor said those words slowly, carefully, like someone stepping across thin ice. And for a moment, Emily Carter thought she had misunderstood him. The fluorescent lights above the hospital consultation room hummed softly, casting a pale glow across the desk where a thin folder of medical reports lay open between them. Emily's fingers tightened around the edge of the chair as the doctor adjusted his glasses and looked down at the page again, as if hoping the numbers might somehow rearrange themselves into something easier to explain. Just an hour earlier, she had been walking through the maternity wing carrying a small bouquet of pale yellow daisies, her heart full of gratitude for the woman who had given her and her husband the miracle they had waited nearly 8 years to experience. Rachel had carried their child for 9 months, endured every doctor's appointment, every sleepless night, every uncomfortable symptom, and she had done it all with quiet patience and a gentle smile that Emily still couldn't quite believe was real. To Emily, Rachel had been a stranger who chose kindness, someone brave enough to help another woman become a mother. But now the doctor cleared his throat and slid the lab results closer to Emily, the paper rustling against the polished wood surface of the desk. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "we ran an extended compatibility panel during the delivery process, just as part of our routine review. There was nothing medically concerning about the pregnancy, but the system flagged something unusual in the genetic markers." Emily blinked, confused. Her mind was still lingering on the memory of holding her newborn son only a few hours earlier, counting his tiny fingers and toes, breathing in that warm newborn scent that made the world feel suddenly brighter. She had thanked Rachel through tears, promising that the kindness she had shown their family would never be forgotten. Rachel had simply squeezed her hand and said, "You deserve this happiness." At the time, Emily thought those words were just compassion. But now the doctor turned the paper around so Emily could see the highlighted numbers running across the page. "These markers," he continued quietly, tapping the line with the tip of his pen, "indicate a close biological relationship between you and the surrogate." Emily frowned, trying to follow what he meant. "Close how?" she asked. The doctor hesitated for just a second too long. Then he met her eyes. "Close enough that our system automatically flagged the result." Emily's heartbeat began to thud in her ears, loud and uneven. The room suddenly felt smaller. The doctor exhaled slowly before speaking again. "Mrs. Carter, the genetic match between you and Rachel isn't random." His voice softened, almost apologetic. "According to the DNA analysis, Rachel isn't just the woman who carried your child." Emily's breath caught as the words settled into the quiet space between them. The doctor finally said the sentence that would change everything she thought she knew about her life. "Rachel shares your biological profile at a sibling level, which means the woman who carried your baby is almost certainly your long-lost sister." Emily stared at the paper in front of her while the doctor's words echoed in the quiet room, but her mind could not settle on the numbers or the medical terms printed across the page. Instead, it drifted backward through the years, returning to a time long before the hospital, before the pregnancy, before Rachel had ever entered her life. For nearly 8 years, Emily and her husband Daniel had been trying to build the family they had dreamed about since the day they were married. In the beginning, they believed it would happen naturally, the way it seemed to happen for so many of their friends. They imagined a small nursery in their house outside Columbus, Ohio, a soft yellow room with a rocking chair by the window and shelves filled with picture books. But month after month passed, and the quiet hope that once filled their home slowly turned into worry. After the first year, Emily scheduled an appointment with a fertility specialist, expecting reassurance and maybe a simple explanation. Instead, the doctor ordered tests, then more tests, each one bringing new uncertainty. Daniel held her hand through every appointment, sitting beside her in sterile exam rooms that smelled faintly of disinfectant and coffee from the waiting area down the hall. They tried treatments that required early morning injections, hormone medications, and endless monitoring visits before sunrise. Emily memorized the routine of the fertility clinic the way commuters memorize their daily train schedule. She learned the exact distance from the parking garage to the elevator, learned which nurse always offered warm smiles, and which waiting room chair had the best view of the morning sunlight. For a while, the doctors believed in vitro fertilization might solve everything. Emily remembered the fragile excitement they felt during their first attempt, how Daniel bought a tiny pair of baby socks from a department store and tucked them into his desk drawer as a quiet promise to the future. But that cycle ended with disappointment. The next one did too. Then another. Each attempt carried the same hopeful beginning followed by the same quiet phone call from the clinic that started with the words, "We are sorry." By the fifth year, the process had become exhausting in ways Emily had never expected. It was not just the medical procedures or the early morning appointments. It was the silence afterward, the drive home with Daniel gripping the steering wheel while neither of them knew what to say. Their house felt too quiet during those evenings, the empty second bedroom down the hallway becoming a constant reminder of the life they had imagined. Daniel tried to stay strong for her, often saying, "We will find a way. Families are built in more than one way." Emily wanted to believe him, but hope had begun to feel fragile. Then one autumn afternoon, their doctor mentioned another possibility during a consultation. Surrogacy. The word sounded both distant and miraculous at the same time. A woman willing to carry their child when Emily could not. It was an idea that felt overwhelming at first, filled with legal steps, emotional questions, and trust that seemed almost impossible to place in someone they had never met. Emily remembered walking out of the clinic that day with Daniel as leaves fell across the parking lot, the air crisp with the first hint of winter. Daniel squeezed her hand and said quietly, "Maybe this is the path that was waiting for us all along." At the time, Emily had no way of knowing that the woman who would soon enter their lives as a surrogate was already connected to her by something deeper than kindness, something hidden by decades of separation and silence. The decision to move forward with surrogacy did not happen overnight. For weeks, Emily and Daniel talked about it during quiet evenings at their kitchen table, long after the dinner plates had been cleared and the house had grown. Still, sometimes they spoke hopefully, imagining the possibility that a child might finally fill the empty bedroom at the end of the hallway. Other nights they sat in silence, both aware that inviting another person into something so personal required a level of trust that felt almost frightening. Emily worried about everything. What kind of woman would volunteer for something like this? What if she changed her mind halfway through the pregnancy? What if the emotional connection became complicated in ways none of them expected? Daniel listened patiently each time, always answering in the same calm voice that had carried them through years of uncertainty. He reminded her that kindness still existed in the world, and that somewhere there might be someone willing to help simply because she believed in giving another family a chance. Eventually, their doctor connected them with a reputable surrogacy program that carefully screened every candidate. The process included interviews, background checks, psychological evaluations, and medical testing that lasted for months. Emily filled out forms that asked deeply personal questions about her life, her marriage, and her hopes for the future. It felt strange to place their most private dreams into official paperwork, but she told herself that this was simply another step toward the family they had waited so long to meet. One afternoon in early spring, the agency finally called and told them that a potential surrogate had completed the screening process and was interested in learning more about their story. Emily remembered the moment clearly because she had been standing in the grocery store parking lot when the call came through. She sat in the driver's seat with the engine running while the representative explained that the woman was 32 years old, lived 2 hours away, and had previously volunteered in community programs supporting young families. Her name was Rachel. The first meeting took place inside a quiet conference room at the surrogacy center a few weeks later. Emily arrived early with Daniel, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. When the door finally opened, Rachel stepped inside with a gentle smile that immediately softened the tension in the room. She was not what Emily had expected. There was nothing dramatic about her presence. She wore simple clothes, spoke in a calm, steady voice, and carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had already thought deeply about the decision she was making. Rachel listened as Emily and Daniel shared their story, nodding occasionally, her expression warm but thoughtful. When it was her turn to speak, she explained that she had always believed families should help one another whenever possible. She said she did not see surrogacy as a sacrifice, but as an opportunity to give something meaningful to someone who had been waiting a long time for happiness. Emily noticed something unusual during that conversation, though she could not explain it at the time. There was a strange sense of familiarity in Rachel's presence, like meeting someone whose face felt oddly recognizable even though you knew you had never crossed paths before. When Rachel laughed at one of Daniel's lighthearted jokes, the sound felt strangely comforting, almost like hearing an echo from somewhere in the past. Emily brushed the thought aside, assuming it was simply relief that the long process had finally led them to someone kind and sincere. Yet as the meeting continued, she could not shake the feeling that something deeper connected them, something invisible that neither of them could yet see. The agreement with the surrogacy program was finalized a few weeks after that first meeting, and from that moment forward, Rachel slowly became part of Emily and Daniel's daily lives in ways none of them had expected. At the beginning, everything followed the structured plan outlined by the clinic. There were medical appointments, counseling sessions, and long discussions with lawyers who carefully explained every step of the arrangement to make sure everyone felt comfortable and protected. Emily approached those early weeks with cautious optimism, constantly reminding herself that this journey required patience and trust. Rachel handled the process with a calm confidence that impressed both Emily and Daniel. She arrived early to every appointment, listened carefully to the doctors, and asked thoughtful questions about the health of the future child. There was a quiet steadiness about her that made people feel at ease. Emily began to notice that Rachel did not treat the pregnancy like a transaction or an obligation. Instead, she treated it like something meaningful, almost personal. During one visit to the clinic, Rachel asked the nurse about Emily's childhood allergies so the baby's environment could be prepared in advance. Another time she asked Daniel what kind of books he loved as a child because she believed those stories should be waiting in the nursery when the baby arrived. These small gestures touched Emily more deeply than she expected. As the weeks passed, they began speaking more frequently outside of the clinic. Sometimes they met for lunch at a quiet cafe halfway between their towns. Other times Rachel simply called in the evening to update Emily about how she was feeling that day. The conversations often drifted away from medical topics and toward ordinary life. Rachel talked about growing up in foster care for several years before being adopted by a couple who lived in rural Indiana. She described childhood summers spent helping in a small vegetable garden behind their farmhouse and evenings listening to old country music on the radio while her adoptive father fixed tools in the garage. Emily listened carefully, noticing how Rachel spoke about those memories with gratitude, but also with a faint sense of distance, as if part of her story had always remained incomplete. During one of their lunches, Emily caught herself studying Rachel more closely than usual. The resemblance was subtle but undeniable once she allowed herself to notice it. The shape of Rachel's eyes was almost identical to her own, and when Rachel smiled, a small dimple appeared on the left side of her cheek in exactly the same place Emily had seen in photographs of herself since childhood. At first, Emily dismissed the observation as coincidence. The world was full of people who shared similar features. Yet the feeling of familiarity continued to grow stronger each time they met. Rachel also seemed to notice it in quiet ways. Once, while waiting in the clinic lobby, Rachel laughed softly and said that strangers had already assumed they were sisters because of their similar expressions. Emily smiled politely at the comment, but the words lingered in her mind long after the appointment ended. As spring turned into summer and the medical preparations moved forward, the doctors finally confirmed that everything was ready for the embryo transfer. Emily remembered standing beside Rachel in the hospital hallway that morning, sunlight pouring through the large windows at the end of the corridor. Rachel placed a reassuring hand on Emily's shoulder and said something that seemed simple at the time, yet carried a strange weight behind it. She said that sometimes life had a way of bringing the right people together at exactly the moment they were needed most. Emily thanked her, believing those words were simply encouragement for the long journey ahead, never imagining that Rachel might have understood their connection long before anyone else. The embryo transfer took place on a quiet morning that felt strangely ordinary compared to the importance of the moment. Emily remembered how the hallway outside the fertility clinic smelled faintly of coffee and antiseptic, while soft instrumental music played from hidden speakers in the waiting room. She sat beside Daniel with her hands folded tightly in her lap, trying to steady the nervous energy that seemed to run through every part of her body. Across from them, Rachel looked calm as ever, flipping slowly through a magazine she clearly was not reading. When the nurse finally called her name, Rachel stood up and smiled reassuringly at Emily, as if she were the one offering comfort instead of the other way around. The procedure itself was brief, far less dramatic than Emily had imagined during all those years of hoping for this chance. Yet when the doctor emerged afterward with a quiet smile and said that everything had gone smoothly, Emily felt something shift inside her chest, a fragile new beginning that she hardly dared to believe in. The following days felt longer than any she could remember. The doctors explained that it would take about 10 days before the first blood test could confirm whether the transfer had been successful. 10 days suddenly felt like a lifetime. Emily tried to continue her normal routine at work, answering emails and attending meetings, but her thoughts kept drifting back to Rachel and the possibility that their dream might finally be taking root. Rachel called often during that waiting period, always sounding steady and optimistic. She spoke about small things like the weather, the book she had started reading, and the garden she was planting outside her house. Yet each conversation carried a quiet undercurrent of hope that both women felt but rarely spoke aloud. On the morning of the blood test, Emily and Daniel drove to the clinic before sunrise, the sky still pale gray above the parking lot. Rachel arrived shortly after them, wearing a loose sweater and carrying a travel mug of tea. She greeted them with the same warm smile Emily had come to recognize, though there was a flicker of nervous anticipation in her eyes. The blood draw took only a few minutes, but the wait for results stretched through the entire morning. Emily paced the small hallway near the reception desk, while Daniel tried to distract her with gentle conversation. Rachel remained seated with remarkable patience, occasionally glancing toward Emily as if she wanted to reassure her without using words. Finally, the doctor appeared holding a chart and motioned for them to step into his office. Emily could barely breathe as they sat down across from his desk. For a moment, the doctor studied the page before looking up with a quiet smile. He said that the hormone levels indicated a healthy, early pregnancy. The words seemed to echo through the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. Emily felt Daniel's hand close around hers while tears filled her eyes before she even realized they were coming. Rachel simply smiled and placed one hand lightly over her heart, as if she had been carrying this hope all along. In the weeks that followed, the pregnancy progressed smoothly, and with each passing appointment, Emily felt her connection to Rachel deepen in ways she had never expected. They shared long conversations during ultrasound visits, laughed together about cravings for strange combinations of food, and celebrated each milestone as though they were traveling the journey side by side rather than from opposite sides of it. Yet beneath the joy, Emily continued to feel that quiet sense of familiarity growing stronger, as though the bond forming between them had existed long before this child ever entered their lives. By the middle of the second trimester, the pregnancy had settled into a calm and steady rhythm, and the three of them had begun to move through the months with a quiet sense of shared anticipation. Emily often found herself counting the weeks the way children count down the days before a holiday, marking small milestones on the calendar that hung beside the refrigerator in her kitchen. Each doctor visit became a moment of reassurance, a confirmation that the tiny life they had waited so long for was continuing to grow safely. Rachel handled the physical changes with the same calm patience she had shown since the beginning, though Emily sometimes noticed the subtle ways pregnancy demanded more energy from her. Rachel walked a little slower than she had before and occasionally rested her hands against her lower back after long appointments, but she never complained. Instead, she focused on the positive moments, especially the day they heard the baby's heartbeat clearly through the ultrasound monitor. The sound filled the examination room with a rapid, steady rhythm that seemed almost unbelievable in its strength. Emily remembered gripping Daniel's arm while tears ran down her cheeks as the doctor turned the monitor so they could see the small, flickering movement on the screen. Rachel watched quietly beside them, her expression warm and thoughtful, as though she understood exactly how much that sound meant to the two people standing next to her. After the appointment, they celebrated with lunch at a small diner down the street from the clinic, the kind with red vinyl booths and large windows that looked out onto the busy intersection. Emily could still remember the sunlight reflecting off the chrome trim along the counter, while Rachel laughed softly about her sudden craving for lemon pie. During that meal, Emily noticed something again that she had seen once or twice before, but had never mentioned out loud. When Rachel reached across the table for her glass of water, the sleeve of her sweater slipped slightly down her arm, revealing a small birthmark just above her wrist. Emily felt a brief moment of surprise because the mark looked almost identical to one she had carried since childhood. It was a faint curved shape about the size of a dime, located in nearly the same place on her own wrist. Emily instinctively touched the edge of her sleeve where her own mark rested underneath the fabric. She had seen that mark in family photos for as long as she could remember, a tiny detail she had never considered meaningful until that moment. Rachel noticed Emily's expression and glanced down at her own wrist before smiling. She said that people had commented on that mark before, joking that it looked like a small crescent moon. Emily nodded politely and laughed along with the casual remark, though the sense of familiarity returned stronger than before. It was not just the birthmark or the shape of Rachel's eyes, or the way her smile appeared suddenly when she was amused. It was something deeper, a quiet sense of connection that felt difficult to explain. Later that afternoon, while they were walking back to their cars in the parking lot, Rachel paused for a moment and looked at Emily with a thoughtful expression. She said something that sounded simple, but lingered strangely in Emily's mind long after they said goodbye. Rachel said that sometimes the people who come into our lives during important moments are not strangers at all. They are simply people we have been meant to find all along. At the time, Emily assumed Rachel was speaking about the surrogacy journey itself, about the trust and kindness that had brought them together. Yet as Emily drove home through the warm afternoon sunlight, she could not shake the feeling that Rachel's words carried a deeper meaning waiting quietly beneath the surface. As summer slowly turned toward early autumn, the pregnancy reached a stage where every small change felt significant, and Emily found herself paying closer attention to the details of each visit with Rachel. The clinic appointments had become familiar now, almost routine, yet there was always a quiet excitement whenever the nurse guided them into the ultrasound room and dimmed the lights. The screen would glow softly as the technician adjusted the equipment, and soon the outline of the baby appeared again, moving gently in a way that still felt almost miraculous. Emily never grew tired of those moments. Each image on the monitor felt like a promise slowly becoming real. Rachel watched those appointments with the same steady warmth she had shown from the beginning. But there were moments when Emily noticed a thoughtful expression pass across her face, as though Rachel was quietly reflecting on something she had not yet spoken aloud. One afternoon after a routine checkup, the doctor explained that everything continued to look healthy and that the baby was developing exactly on schedule. The news filled Emily with a deep sense of relief, and she suggested they stop by a small park nearby before heading home. The park sat beside a narrow lake where tall maple trees created patches of shade across a winding walking path. Rachel agreed, saying the fresh air might help with the mild fatigue she had been feeling that week. As they walked slowly along the path, Rachel rested one hand lightly over her stomach, while Emily carried a small bottle of water the nurse had given her at the clinic. The afternoon sunlight filtered through the leaves above them, creating patterns of gold and green on the pavement. After a few minutes, Rachel glanced toward Emily and asked a question that caught her slightly off guard. She asked whether Emily had ever wondered if she might have siblings somewhere in the world. The question sounded casual at first, almost like the kind of thought people share during quiet conversations. Yet something about Rachel's tone made Emily pause. Emily explained that she had grown up believing she was an only child. Her parents had always said that their family was small but close, and she had never questioned that explanation. Rachel listened carefully while they continued walking beside the lake, nodding slowly as though she were processing every detail. After a moment, she smiled softly and said that life sometimes holds surprises that take years to reveal themselves. Emily laughed lightly and replied that she doubted there were any hidden chapters left in her family story, but Rachel did not respond immediately. Instead, she looked out across the water where a group of ducks moved slowly near the edge of the shore. There was a quiet pause before she spoke again, her voice thoughtful but calm. She said that sometimes the people who share our lives are connected by more than coincidence, even if we do not recognize those connections right away. Emily felt a faint shiver of curiosity pass through her, though she could not explain why the words seemed to carry extra meaning. She simply assumed Rachel was reflecting on the unusual bond that had formed between them through the pregnancy. Yet as they finished their walk and returned to the parking lot, Emily noticed Rachel studying her face for a brief moment with a gentle but searching expression, as if she were looking for something familiar that had been hidden for many years. The final months of the pregnancy arrived faster than Emily expected, and with each passing week the sense that something extraordinary was unfolding grew stronger. The nursery in Emily and Daniel's house was finally finished now, painted in a soft shade of pale yellow with white shelves along one wall, and a rocking chair placed near the window where the afternoon sunlight spilled across the floor. Emily often found herself standing quietly in that room, imagining the small life that would soon fill it with laughter and late-night lullabies. Yet the person she thought about most during those moments was Rachel. By now their connection had grown into something that felt deeper than the original agreement they had signed months earlier. They had shared doctor visits, long conversations, quiet walks, and countless small moments that built a bond Emily could not easily explain. Rachel seemed to understand Emily in ways that surprised her, finishing thoughts before they were spoken and noticing emotions Emily had not even expressed out loud. One cool morning in late October, Rachel called Emily and asked if she could stop by the house for a visit. The baby was due in only a few weeks, and the doctor had encouraged Rachel to stay close to the hospital during the final stage of the pregnancy. Emily welcomed the idea immediately. When Rachel arrived that afternoon, the air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke drifting through the neighborhood. She stepped inside wearing a loose sweater and comfortable shoes, her hands resting gently against the curve of her stomach. Emily noticed again how natural Rachel looked in the house, as though she had been visiting there for years instead of months. Daniel greeted her warmly before leaving for an afternoon meeting, giving the two women time to talk quietly together in the living room. At one point, Rachel asked if she could see the nursery before the baby arrived. Emily led her down the hallway and opened the door to the small room that had once felt painfully empty. Now it held a crib, a soft blanket folded neatly at the foot of the mattress, and a small mobile hanging above it with tiny wooden stars that turned slowly whenever the window was open. Rachel stepped inside and stood very still for a moment as she looked around the room. Emily noticed that her eyes seemed slightly brighter than usual, as though she were holding back a wave of emotion she did not want to reveal. Rachel walked slowly to the crib and rested her hand along the edge of the wooden rail. After a quiet pause, she spoke in a gentle voice that carried a strange mixture of joy and sadness. She said that this child was going to grow up surrounded by love, and that Emily had waited a long time for that moment to arrive. Emily thanked her again for everything she had done, but Rachel shook her head softly, as if the gratitude belonged somewhere else. Then she said something that lingered deeply in Emily's mind long after the words left her lips. Rachel said that sometimes the greatest gifts we give one another are not about obligation or sacrifice, but about bringing something back into a family that had been missing for a very long time. Emily assumed she meant the baby, yet the way Rachel said the sentence made it sound as though she was speaking about something far older than the child who would soon be born. The baby arrived on a quiet winter morning just after sunrise, when the sky outside the hospital windows was still pale and the parking lot lights had not yet turned off. Emily remembered every detail of that morning with astonishing clarity, as though time itself had slowed to allow each moment to settle gently into memory. The hospital room felt warm and calm, filled with the soft sounds of nurses moving through the hallway and the steady beeping of monitors that seemed to mark the rhythm of a new beginning. Daniel stood beside Emily holding her hand while the medical team guided Rachel through the final hours of labor with careful attention and quiet encouragement. Rachel remained remarkably composed, breathing steadily and speaking in short, reassuring sentences whenever Emily's emotions threatened to overwhelm her. Emily could hardly believe that the moment they had waited for nearly a decade had finally arrived. When the baby's first cry filled the room, it felt like the sound of hope breaking through years of uncertainty. The nurse gently wrapped the newborn in a soft blanket and placed the tiny bundle into Emily's arms. For a moment, Emily could not speak at all. She simply stared down at the small face resting against the white fabric, overwhelmed by the realization that the child she had dreamed about for so long was finally here. Daniel leaned close with tears in his eyes, while the nurse quietly explained that both the baby and Rachel were doing very well. Rachel lay resting against the pillows with a peaceful expression, watching Emily hold the child with a kind of quiet satisfaction that seemed deeper than simple relief. After the initial excitement settled, the room grew calmer again, and Emily eventually walked over to Rachel's bedside with the baby still cradled carefully in her arms. She thanked Rachel again, her voice trembling with emotion as she tried to express how much this gift meant to their family. Rachel reached out gently and touched the baby's tiny hand, smiling softly before looking up at Emily with a thoughtful expression. She said that seeing Emily become a mother had been worth every step of the journey. Then she added something else in a quieter voice that Emily did not fully understand at the time. Rachel said that sometimes the most important parts of our lives are connected in ways we cannot recognize until everything finally comes together. Emily assumed she was speaking about the long path that had brought them all into that hospital room together. Yet there was a subtle weight behind the sentence that lingered in Emily's thoughts even as the nurses began preparing the paperwork for discharge later that afternoon. Rachel remained at the hospital for observation while Emily and Daniel moved to a nearby recovery room with their newborn son. By the evening, Emily expected Rachel to visit again before returning home, but instead a nurse quietly explained that Rachel had already been discharged earlier than planned and had asked the staff to pass along a short message. The note simply wished Emily and Daniel happiness and thanked them for allowing her to be part of their story. Emily felt a strange mixture of gratitude and confusion when she heard the news. Rachel had been such a steady presence throughout the entire pregnancy that her sudden departure felt unexpectedly abrupt. Still, Emily assumed Rachel simply wanted privacy after the emotional experience of childbirth. She had no reason yet to suspect that Rachel's quiet exit from the hospital was connected to a truth far more complicated than anyone in that room had realized. The first weeks at home with the baby passed in a blur of sleepless nights, quiet lullabies, and the gentle rhythm of a life that finally felt complete. Emily often sat in the rocking chair beside the nursery window long after midnight, holding her son close while the house remained silent around her. Outside, the winter air carried a faint glow from the streetlights that reflected softly across the snow lining the sidewalks. During those quiet hours, Emily sometimes found herself thinking about Rachel. The woman who had been such an important part of their journey had suddenly stepped away with almost no explanation, leaving behind only the brief message the nurse had shared. At the hospital, at first Emily assumed Rachel simply needed time to return to her normal life after months of careful medical supervision and emotional commitment. Surrogacy agreements often ended with a respectful distance so that both families could move forward peacefully. Still, the absence felt strangely personal. Rachel had been present through every stage of the pregnancy, offering encouragement during the anxious weeks and celebrating each milestone as though the baby belonged to all of them in some quiet way. It seemed unusual that she would leave without saying goodbye face to face. A few days after bringing the baby home, Emily decided to send Rachel a message just to thank her once more and to share a photograph of the newborn sleeping peacefully in the crib. She expected a simple reply wishing them well. Instead, the message remained unanswered. Emily told herself that Rachel might simply be resting or catching up on normal life again. But as the days turned into weeks, the silence continued. During that time, Emily also began to notice something else that stirred her curiosity. Several friends and relatives who visited the house commented on how the baby seemed to resemble Emily more than they expected for a child born through surrogacy. One afternoon, Emily's aunt gently laughed while holding the baby and said that the child had the same small dimple on his cheek that Emily had as a newborn. Emily smiled politely at the remark, but felt a quiet flicker of confusion. The embryo had been created using her and Daniel's genetic material, so the resemblance should not have been surprising. Yet the comment reminded her again of the subtle similarities she had noticed between herself and Rachel throughout the pregnancy. The same shape of eyes, the faint crescent-shaped birthmark on the wrist, the way both of them smiled when they were nervous. Emily had dismissed those observations before, but now they began to feel harder to ignore. One evening, while organizing the paperwork from the hospital discharge, Emily came across a copy of the extended laboratory panel that had been included in the delivery records. Most of the information looked routine, but one line caught her attention because it was highlighted with a small notation from the clinic's internal review system. The note mentioned an unusual compatibility result that had been flagged during the testing process. Emily stared at the sentence for a long moment before setting the paper down on the kitchen table. Something about that detail stirred a quiet sense of curiosity she could not easily explain. The pregnancy had ended successfully and everyone was healthy, so the clinic had never discussed the note further. Yet now Emily felt an unexpected urge to understand what the message meant. Without fully realizing why, she decided that the next morning she would call the clinic and ask whether someone could explain the result more clearly. She had no idea that the simple question she planned to ask would lead her toward a discovery that would change the story of her family forever. The next morning, Emily placed her son gently into the crib after the early feeding and walked quietly into the kitchen where the winter sunlight was beginning to brighten the room. The house felt peaceful in that fragile way it often did during the first weeks of motherhood, when the smallest sounds seemed amplified by the quiet. She poured herself a cup of coffee, but barely tasted it, as she sat down at the kitchen table with the hospital paperwork spread in front of her again. The highlighted note from the laboratory report seemed to draw her attention immediately. The words themselves were simple, mentioning an unexpected genetic compatibility flag during routine testing. Yet the sentence carried a weight she could not ignore. After a few minutes, Emily reached for her phone and called the fertility clinic where their entire journey had taken place. The receptionist recognized her name and transferred the call to a medical coordinator who had worked closely with them throughout the pregnancy. Emily explained that she had noticed the notation in the delivery records and wondered if someone could clarify what it meant. The coordinator paused briefly before replying in a careful voice that the result had been automatically generated by the clinic's genetic analysis software and that a physician would be better equipped to explain the details. She asked Emily if she would be willing to come in later that afternoon to review the report in person. A few hours later, Emily found herself once again sitting inside the familiar consultation room where so many important conversations had taken place over the past several years. The same soft fluorescent lights glowed above the desk, and the same folders of medical records were neatly arranged along the shelves behind the doctor's chair. The physician who entered the room greeted her kindly before opening the report and sliding it across the desk. He explained that during the delivery process, the hospital routinely runs an extended genetic compatibility panel between the surrogate and the intended parents as part of the safety review for the newborn. In most cases, the results simply confirm that there are no unexpected medical risks. However, in Emily's case, the system had detected something unusual. Emily felt her heart begin to beat faster as she listened. The doctor pointed to the highlighted section and said that the software had flagged the result because the genetic markers between Emily and Rachel showed a similarity level far beyond what would normally occur between unrelated individuals. He spoke calmly, choosing his words carefully as he explained that the match was strong enough to suggest a direct biological relationship. Emily felt the room grow strangely quiet around her as the meaning of his explanation slowly unfolded. She asked whether the result could be a mistake or a coincidence, but the doctor gently shook his head. The system had already cross-checked the data multiple times. According to the analysis, Rachel shared nearly half of the same genetic markers that Emily carried. That level of similarity was only possible between immediate family members. Emily stared down at the paper in disbelief while the doctor finally spoke the conclusion that connected every unexplained detail she had noticed over the past year. He explained that the genetic match was consistent with a sibling relationship. In other words, the woman who had carried Emily's child was not simply a surrogate chosen through an agency. She was almost certainly Emily's biological sister, separated from her family many years earlier and somehow brought back into her life through a path none of them had ever expected. Emily drove home from the clinic in a quiet haze, the winter landscape outside the windshield passing by in slow motion as her mind struggled to process the truth she had just heard. The roads were familiar, the same streets she had driven countless times during the years of doctor visits and hopeful appointments. Yet everything felt different now. Every memory of Rachel replayed in her mind with new meaning. The similar eyes, the same small birthmark near the wrist, the strange sense of familiarity that had followed them from the very first meeting. Emily could not ignore it anymore. The explanation was sitting in the folder on the passenger seat beside her. When she arrived home, the house was quiet except for the soft sound of her son stirring gently in the nursery. She walked slowly down the hallway and paused in the doorway, watching the baby sleep peacefully beneath the small wooden mobile that turned softly above the crib. The sight usually filled her with calm, But today it carried a deeper emotion she could not quite name. She realized that the woman who had carried this child had not been a stranger at all. Rachel had been family. The thought filled her with gratitude, but also with questions that suddenly felt impossible to ignore. Emily knew there was only one place where the answers might exist. That evening she called her mother, Margaret Carter, and asked if she could come by for a visit. Margaret sounded slightly surprised, but welcomed her warmly as always. Emily bundled the baby into a small carrier and drove across town to the house where she had grown up. The familiar brick home looked exactly the same as it always had, with the porch light glowing softly against the cold evening air. When Margaret opened the door, she smiled immediately at the sight of her grandson and ushered Emily inside. For a few minutes, they spoke about ordinary things while Margaret gently rocked the baby in her arms. Emily watched the scene quietly before finally gathering the courage to ask the question that had been building inside her since the afternoon. She explained what the doctor had told her about the genetic report, and then asked her mother something she had never thought to ask before. Had there ever been another child? Margaret's smile faded slowly as the words settled into the room. She sat down carefully in the armchair and stared at the sleeping baby for a long moment before speaking. Her voice was softer than Emily had ever heard it. She explained that many years earlier, long before Emily could remember anything, life had been much more complicated than she had ever allowed her daughter to see. Margaret admitted that Emily had not been born alone. There had been another baby. The two girls had been twins. Emily felt the room grow very still as her mother continued the story. At the time, Margaret had been young and overwhelmed by circumstances she believed she could not manage alone. With help from a private adoption agency, one of the babies had been placed with another family shortly after birth. Margaret had always hoped the child would grow up safe and loved somewhere in the world. Emily listened in silence as the pieces of the past slowly came together. The doctor's report had not been a coincidence. Rachel had not simply entered their lives through an agency. She had been the sister Emily never knew existed, brought back into her life through a path that none of them could have imagined. The truth settled over Emily like the quiet snowfall outside her childhood home that night, soft but impossible to ignore. For years she had believed her family story was simple, a small household built around 3 people who loved one another deeply. Now she understood that another chapter had existed all along, hidden behind decisions made decades earlier when life had felt uncertain and overwhelming. As Margaret finished explaining the adoption, her voice trembled with emotions she had carried silently for more than 30 years. She said that letting one of the babies go had been the most difficult choice she had ever made, but at the time she believed it was the only way to give both children a chance at a stable life. Margaret admitted that she had often wondered where that child had grown up and whether she had been happy. Emily listened quietly, absorbing every word while gently rocking her son in her arms. Suddenly Rachel's presence throughout the past year made perfect sense. The quiet familiarity Emily had felt during their first meeting, the shared expressions, the matching birthmark, the strange moments when Rachel seemed to understand her thoughts before they were spoken. None of it had been coincidence. Rachel had been part of her life long before either of them realized it. Emily asked her mother one final question that had been forming in her mind since leaving the clinic. She wanted to know if Rachel had known the truth before the pregnancy began. Margaret hesitated before answering, explaining that the adoption records had remained sealed for many years but could eventually be accessed once both children reached adulthood. It was possible that Rachel had discovered the connection first and chosen to remain silent until the right moment appeared. The idea sent a quiet wave of emotion through Emily's heart. She suddenly remembered Rachel's thoughtful words throughout the pregnancy, the gentle way she spoke about family, the meaningful pauses in conversations that had once seemed mysterious. Perhaps Rachel had known all along. Later that evening, Emily returned home and placed her sleeping son gently into the crib while the soft glow of the nursery lamp filled the room. She sat in the rocking chair for a long time, holding the phone in her hands while she searched through the contact information she still had from the surrogacy agency. Eventually, she found the number Rachel had used during the pregnancy. For a moment, Emily simply stared at the screen, uncertain what she would say if Rachel answered. Finally, she sent a simple message. She wrote that she had learned the truth about their connection and that she wanted Rachel to know she was not just grateful for the pregnancy, but grateful for the chance to find the sister she never knew she had. Minutes passed quietly as Emily watched the small mobile turn slowly above the crib. Then the phone vibrated softly in her hand. Rachel's reply appeared on the screen with only a few words. She wrote that she had discovered the adoption records 2 years earlier and had spent a long time wondering whether she should try to find Emily. When she eventually saw Emily's story through the surrogacy agency profile, she felt certain that life had opened a door for them both. Rachel explained that she had chosen to help not only because Emily deserved to become a mother, but because she believed it might also bring their family back together in a way that felt natural and meaningful. Emily felt tears form in her eyes as she read the message again. She looked across the room at her sleeping son and realized that the child resting peacefully in the crib had unknowingly become the bridge between two sisters separated since the day they were born. And in that quiet moment, Emily understood that the journey that began with hope for a child had unexpectedly led her to something even greater, the return of a family that had been missing for an entire lifetime.